Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just checking that you are still awake after a lovely lunch. So it was good to have some feedback there. Tarina, thank you for that lovely introduction. Talita and the organizing committee, thank you for inviting me to join you today and to speak with you about multisystemic resilience, what that is, and why it's really important that we understand that multisystemic resilience is foundational to the well-being of young people living in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa more broadly. So, since the dawn of our democracy, South Africans have learned to pause. On the 24th of September every year, we pause literally. It's a public holiday. And we pause for a very important reason. We stop to reflect on what it is that is common to us as South Africans that we can call our inheritance or our heritage. And when we reflect on that heritage, we celebrate the fact that we live in an incredibly beautiful country with incredibly wonderful people that come from diverse cultural backgrounds. We celebrate the fact that the people of our country embrace different cultural values. They embrace different ways of being. They have different ways of doing. And we appreciate that diversity, those cultural contrasts, if you like, bring richness and bring strength to us as a nation. As part of that, we celebrate that we have very many ordinary South Africans who do inspiring things that make us proud to be South African. But we also celebrate the fact that we have many famous South Africans. And I think one of the things that unites us as South Africans is our love of sport. And so we were very chuffed earlier this year when Tatiana Smith won a gold at the Olympic Games. She was an ex-Tux student, so that made us doubly proud if we work at the University of Pretoria, but we were very proud. And dare I say, in some households, I think people had even more joy and more pride when the Springboks won the championship a couple of weeks ago, and we were thrilled with our Amaboka. And I think it reminded us of the early days of our democracy in 1995 when the Springboks won the World Cup and our very dear President Nelson Mandela was still with us to co-receive that trophy. Just as an aside, if you are a happiness researcher and if you are wanting to research happiness in South Africa and you're looking for a shortcut, then might I suggest that you check when last the Springboks won? Because you're likely to see that there's quite an interesting correlation between the recency of a Springbok victory and the levels of happiness in this country. But more seriously, despite this incredible heritage that we share, despite the fact that I think we are at a promising moment politically in our country, it is unfortunately true that many people will tell you that South Africa is probably one of the worst places to be living at this point in time. And it's going to depend who you talk to as to why this is a bad place to be living. But I suspect that there are likely to be three reasons, particularly if you talk to young South Africans. And I'm focusing on young South Africans this afternoon. And I think the first of those three reasons is going to relate to the fact that we have a hunger crisis in our country. The 2024 statistics say that 2 in every 3 households, more or less, are food insecure. And the young people that I work with in the resilience studies tell me that that means you sleep hungry. And you sleep hungry very often. It's possibly related to the second theme that you're likely to hear when people explain why they are not happy to be living in this country. And that is that we have of the highest unemployment rates in the world. The Afrobarometer will bear the unhappiness, will testify to the unhappiness of South Africans about our unemployment rate. And I know the statistics differ, but the idea is that currently approximately 1 in every 3 South Africans is unemployed. And if you focus on young South Africans, 15 to 34-year-olds, that statistic is worse. So the 2024 stats suggest that between 43 and 45% of 15 to 34-year-olds are either unemployed or NEET, not in employment, education, or training. That's just about 1 in every 2 young people in our country. And so what that means is that life is incredibly hard for young people, and what makes it harder is the third theme of rampant and very violent crime. And you might be thinking, well, they're probably intertwined. They very well could be. We know that hungry people are angry people. But whatever the reason, taken together, these ongoing, apparently intractable challenges mean that the young people that I have the privilege of working with repeatedly tell me that their life is a series of sufferings. So I'm going to refer to the Resilient Youth in Stressed Environments study quite a bit in my talk this afternoon. It's a study that we did from 2017 to 2022 in very stressed communities in the Free State and in Mpumalanga. And we've documented the methodology, so I'm happy to give you the methodology paper if you want to read about the mixed methods that we used. Suffice it here to say that they taught us, the young people, approximately 900 of them who participated in the study, taught us that because of the series of sufferings, their dreams were limited. So for them, for their families, for their communities, there was this intimate experience of helplessness, of hopelessness, of despair, and that the future is bleak. Now, I wouldn't blame you for thinking, what on earth is she going on about the risks for? This is supposed to be a conference about well-being and happiness, and now she's depressing us. Well, there's a reason for that. You cannot study resilience in the absence of risk. Risk is a precondition for the study of resilience. It's also a precondition for people to be able to demonstrate resilience. And so literally what that means is that South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa provide us with a living resilience laboratory. We have an ongoing opportunity to try and understand what it is that explains better than expected outcomes when people are exposed to incredibly high levels of risk. That's the definition of resilience. You see, the decades and decades and decades of risk-focused studies that we've done teach us that if people face chronic and acute levels of high risk, they're unlikely to report well-being. They're unlikely to report educational progress. They're unlikely to report mental health. They're unlikely to be happy. And so when we see the opposite, we witness better than expected outcomes, and we infer that resilience is at play. I'll give you an example. One wouldn't think that given the challenges that I explained a slide or two back, South Africans would report happiness. But according to the 2024 World Happiness Report, apparently our happiness levels are rising, and apparently significantly so. Similarly, given the socially maligned conditions that characterize our country, you wouldn't expect our children to report hope. And you wouldn't expect our children to report well-being. And yet, the sterling work that Professor Shazli Saval and his colleagues have done across 9 provinces in our country show that children in this country are reporting very high levels of hope and very high levels of well-being. And so that brings us to the question, if the risks are apparently intractable, what is it? What is galvanizing this capacity for better than expected outcomes? And I'd like to spend the next couple of slides looking at that. Once we've had a look at that, we're going to consider whether it's possible to extrapolate a sort of a one-size-fits-all recipe for resilience. Wouldn't that be lovely? So that we could advance resilience amongst young people who are vulnerable to many challenges. And then we'll conclude by considering next steps. What does this mean for practitioners? What does it mean for society? What does it mean for researchers? So starting with the first question, I'm going to keep quiet, and I'm going to give you the popular answer. I'm going to try. I get knocked down, but I get up again. You're never gonna keep me down. I get knocked down, but I get up again. Right? Why are our young people capable of showing resilience? Believe it or not, it's not because they can dance magnificently, and it's not music, although maybe there is a resilience study in that. The popular answer is that young people are strong. And that popular answer brings the focus onto personal capacity. It's an answer that's been popularized by the press. When the South African press reports on famous South Africans and their resilience, what do they typically do? They zoom in on something like mental fortitude or similar personal qualities. When they report on the resilience of ordinary, everyday South Africans who are battling these incredible challenges, they do the same. They immediately foreground personal capacities like agency, or like the ability to solve problems really creatively. And yes, those matter, but there's a focus there that speaks to only the personal. When we talk to young people in our resilience studies, we hear an echo of this. Young people are very good at bringing our attention to what they contribute to their resilience. The young people in the RISE study often spoke about a warrior spirit, this internal strength that allows them to fight against or to resist the predictions that are associated with growing up in a stressed community. In the current R-NEAT study, the Welcome study that Tarina mentioned, the young people very often talk to us about the importance of having a superhuman quality. The idea that resilience is all in them and what's in them needs to be so strong that they're just about supermen and superwomen. Now, there are probably reasons for that. There are probably worrying reasons, as we theorized in some of the systematic reviews that we did, that the environments of these young people are not providing sufficient resources, that they have to be their own default resource. Or maybe it's because of the developmental stage. We know young people are preoccupied with the self. But whatever the reason, the systematic reviews that we've done of the resilience studies in South Africa and the resilience studies across sub-Saharan Africa report the prominence of the self when people explain resilience. It's not endemic to us. It's not endemic to Africa. It's the same in the international studies of resilience. Repeatedly, there is over-attention to what Michael Unger calls these rugged psychological qualities, what's in the self. Now, those qualities are important, but those qualities are only part of the answer as to why the young people in our country and sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere can report better than expected outcomes when life is incredibly challenging. The rest of the answer lies in the systems that young people are connected to. And the default answer there is very often young people's relationships. Now, you might think, well, that makes sense. We are relational beings. A very good and recent example, and I don't know whether it was by accident or whether she did it on purpose. But when Tatiana Smith received her gold medal, she wore a T-shirt. She wore the T-shirt that you're seeing on my slide. And listed on that T-shirt is all the resources that she attributed her victory to. So she was kind of saying, again, I don't know if this was purposeful or by accident, but she was kind of saying to the press, get real, guys. It's more than what's in me. It's also whom I'm connected to. Most of what's listed is relationships, but she does mention her spiritual beliefs. And she's nudging us towards something that is also in the literature. The reviews that we did show that in sub-Saharan Africa, including South Africa, there is almost as much attention to relational resources as there is to personal resources. But that's not good enough, because what about the other resources? So when we look at the international literature, for example, we are beginning to understand that institution-facilitated opportunities like good education and spaces and places in the natural environment are also important to the well-being of young people. And so this has changed, quite literally, how we are theorizing resilience. There is a drive to explain resilience in ways that make it explicit that these better than expected outcomes are co-produced or they are co-facilitated by a combination or a network, if you like, of resources that are distributed across system levels. So literally when young people show us these better than expected outcomes, you should be anticipating that there would be resources at the level of their body, their psyche, their relationships, and their environment. And that provides a fuller account of why young people do okay, why they are well when life is incredibly challenging. In relationship with the ways that resilience is now being theorized, the definition of resilience has changed. If you are a resilience researcher or if you're interested in resilience, I'm pretty sure you've read Anne Maston's work. She's the doyenne of resilience research. And up until 2021, Anne used to define resilience without the section on my slide that's in green. So she simply defined resilience as this capacity of young people to be okay and do okay when life is very challenging. And subsequent to the attention to these resources in the systems that young people are connected to, she explicitly changed the definition to say that we need to account for multi-system processes. Now you may be wondering, how does that show up in the well-being work that we're doing in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa? Well, there's lots of personal resources that are reported, and they should be. The emphasis is still on the relational resources, but there are glimmers. There are glimmers that educational spaces matter, that quality education matters for well-being. The work by Adams and colleagues drew our attention to how important it is for children to have safe, litter-free spaces that are supervised by trustworthy adults, where they can just play and be children if we want them to be able to report well-being when they live these really difficult lives. Similar findings in more recent HOPE studies that have used qualitative methodologies. In these studies, there is still an emphasis on the relational resources and the personal resources. Relational would include social and communal, but there's attention, thanks to Avi's work, on the cultural resources that matter. And in Bongi and Kube's recent work, there is certainly an indication that the physical environment can inspire hope when it provides young people with a concrete, tangible reminder that their goals might be achievable. So in her study, for example, in a really resource-constrained environment, just seeing the smoke billowing out of a nearby industry didn't depress them because their environment was polluted. They acknowledged that. It excited them because it meant there's a chance for work. There's a chance that my parents can be employed, or when I leave school, I can be employed. So the physical environment also matters for hope. Now, the examples I've given you are cross-sectional. They're a snapshot in time. Do we see the same when we try to understand the resilience of young people over time? And I'm only going to give you 2 examples, and they're fairly recent. We worked with a group of young people. In this specific study, or for this specific publication, it was 57 young people over the period of 18 months during COVID. And we interviewed them telephonically and virtually 3 times to try and understand what was enabling their resilience also when they were NEET. And what you're seeing on my slide is their personal capacity. They needed to be able to resist and to forget about or unlearn negative coping mechanisms and to envisage a future self that was successful. But that capacity was rooted in relationships to their family, relationships to their friends, relationships to intimate partners, as well as opportunities for training, opportunities for education, and a physical environment that gave them space to try out entrepreneurial ideas without being chased away by the police or community members. Space to engage in activity that would keep them busy constructively. The young people in this study told us the curse of being NEET is just sitting. And a physical environment that allowed them to keep busy helped them to alleviate that curse. The other example, also during the COVID period, This with a slightly bigger group. This was 223 young people who participated in a mixed method study. It was part of the RISE study. And they completed 3 iterations of the same survey, which included a depression measure. And they completed 3 iterations of qualitative work. We use a lot of art in the research that we do because it very often circumvents language difficulties, and it gives young people an opportunity to express what supports their resilience without us planting ideas in their heads. So on 3 occasions, we asked these young people to draw what they believed was helping them to be okay, even though their lives were so hard. The first thing we did was we used longitudinal modeling, mixture modeling, to understand what the trajectories of mental health were. And we found that there were 4 typical pathways, nothing novel there. George Bonanno found the same when he did work with people in the global north. But the interesting part is that the majority of young people in our study were reporting stable, low depression pathways. In other words, despite these incredibly difficult lives, they were reporting very little, if any, symptoms of depression. The minority were reporting worsening depression symptoms or chronic high depression symptoms. What we were more interested in was what explained these patterns. So we used of the survey data, but also of the qualitative data to try and understand what was happening in the lives of the young people reporting these chronic high symptoms of depression versus worsening symptoms of depression. And you should be able to predict the answer. The only resource, or one of 2 resources, was themselves, with occasional reference to relationships. And typically, when they drew for us, open-ended invitation, what enables you to be okay and do okay when life is hard? The drawing depicted a single solitary figure and an explanation that focused the attention on themselves. When young people were reporting the opposite, stable low symptoms, declining symptoms, then typically both the survey data and their drawings and their personal explanation of the drawings was pointing to a rich combination of resources that included biological or physiological, psychological, social, spiritual, and environmental resources. And together, this combination enabled them to keep going, even when life was hard. So their drawings would show a combination, and their narratives would speak to family, to friends, to faith-based practices, and to the natural environment. So I hope I've repeated myself often enough that you've got the answer. Because the original question was, what is it that enables young people to show resilience in the context of South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa? And the answer is that they need this combination of resources that cut across system levels in order to be able to show better than expected outcomes. So the second question that we said we needed to consider was, can we deduce from this that there's a recipe that we can use to support the resilience of young people? And yesterday, Andrew said that the answer was yes and no, and he said that that was a typical answer that economists give. Well, Andrew, I'm not an economist, but you're getting the same answer. So the answer to the question is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we can certainly see that the combination is repeatedly present and that the combination is across system levels. No, because the detail of the resources is very sensitive to the situational and the cultural context in which young people find themselves. And I'm going to give you an example from the RISE study to illustrate that. And I'm going to, well, it's a very busy slide you're looking at, but what that slide is showing you is that the RISE study wasn't only in Mpumalanga and the Free State in South Africa, it was also in Canada, the similarly stressed community in Canada. And across both contexts, we got this combination of resources that mattered. There were some similarities, they're in blue, but there were a number of differences. And I'm going to talk you through 2 differences, and then I'm going to draw our attention to, even though there were similarities, the similarities were not, the similar resources were not identical. And so the first difference that I want to point you to is the fact that the South African young people in the communities in Mpumalanga and the Free State reported almost no natural environment resources. Context could explain that. It was a very resource-constrained context in very dusty parts of those provinces. There was very little green, and the community certainly didn't have the water access that's needed to keep spaces green. Versus Canada, towards the west of Canada, where there are magnificent mountains and forests and endless prairies. So geographical context could explain that absence. Canada is a very service-rich context. I think one of the things that Canadians pride themselves on is facilitating really good services for their citizens. And so we were not surprised when the Canadian young people repeatedly spoke about a variety of mental health, social support, and other services that they had access to. We heard almost nothing similar from the South Africans. To my colleagues in the room who are psychologists, says a lot about our profession and how accessible it is. I think there was one mention or two mentions of social workers. But instead, we heard about community members. And we heard how neighbors and members of their faith-based community and elders were seen as a resource that was always there, but particularly when times were hard. And we begin to think of the African culture of interdependence and how we emphasize relational well-being. And that could be playing in there. So differences, certainly, and similarities, certainly. But those similarities should not lull us into thinking that if we read a list of resources, we'll know what to do in order to advance resilience. Because you see the word family for the Canadians, and you see the word family for the South Africans. But family in the Canadian context meant a nuclear family that typically had two parent figures. It was definitely not that in the South African context. And again, I'm going to keep quiet, and I'm going to bring you the voices of some of the young people who participated in the RISE study. The people in the RISE study were between the ages of 14 and 24, but they co-opted some children in their community to join into this video, and they made the video expressly. It's a snippet of a longer video so that people would understand what for them, through their eyes, really matters in terms of enabling resilience. It's quite soft in the beginning, so you'll need to listen up, and if you don't hear, I'll repeat it afterwards.
In our house, we have a cold stove, so we use newspapers to light it. I'm usually the one who does it. My granny told me if I'm going to burn the paper, I have to make sure that I know what's written on that paper. So every paper that I threw in the stove, I make sure that I know there's information on that paper. She sometimes asks me questions about that paper. And I was like, no way, she won't see me, you know. But she was always asking, what is that paper you doing? So that was the thing that kept me reading the papers.
So no nuclear family. Instead, you're having this extended family, this flexible kinship system, this family community, and the prominence of women caregivers, which could relate to women's cultural role, and it could relate to the fact that we have many, many women-headed households in South Africa, but certainly in the context of the study. So you can see that we cannot be lulled into complacency by apparent similarities. We have to do the work to understand what that resource means in context. So what I'm suggesting is that the question I asked was a bad question. We shouldn't be asking, is there a one-size-fits-all recipe? We should be changing the question to which combination of these multisystemic resources is best for which young people and for which outcomes, in which or what contexts, and at what level of risk exposure. So I think the examples I gave you certainly showed how this combination could perhaps be different over context, but we didn't really look at how combinations can change depending on the outcome. And to illustrate that quite briefly, I'm going to share some of Lucy Kluver's work. She does very inspiring work across sub-Saharan Africa. And this was a study that she and her team did in the Eastern Cape with 1,063 young people. And they were trying to ascertain what combination of resources do we need to accelerate the SDGs. So to bring about better than expected outcomes for young people living difficult lives. And based on the literature, they had that list. And so if you only use the literature, you might think, well, you can't go wrong with those, right? And maybe you can't. But their work showed that only 3 had a really protective impact. And that when they combined those 3, there was an additive value. And so which were combined depended on the outcome that they were wanting to enable. And I'll give you 2 examples. When they looked to see which of those 3 resources that were impactful made the biggest difference to young people being able to report a good childhood, a childhood in which they were not exposed to any kind of abuse, emotional or physical, then they needed all 3. They needed access to a safe school. Their parents needed support to be enabling parents, but the household also needed a cash transfer. Versus when they looked at school progression, then parents didn't matter so much anymore, which might have something to do with the age of their group of participants. We had a similar study in the RISE study where we could see that parents mattered for school progression when children were younger. And as they grew older, their teachers mattered more because they wanted competent teachers. The bottom line, we need to understand what combination of resources matters for what outcome. So before you plan the intervention, figure out what the outcome of the intervention is, and then you have to extrapolate the resources that fit. So where does that bring us? What does that mean? Can we think about next steps? And I think we should, because otherwise it's the old question of, so you've done all this research and so what? What does it mean for those of us who live in difficult contexts and who want to make a difference in the lives of young people? The first thing that we need to do is that we need to be incredibly explicit. That if we don't theorize and enact resilience in multisystemic ways, then we are offering a neoliberal, socially unjust response in contexts where challenges are apparently intractable. We're doing young people a disservice. We're setting them up to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and then to feel their own bootstraps and then to feel dreadful when they fail, instead of doing what we should be doing. And that is that we need to understand that instead of this person-focused resilience, resilience requires a facilitative environment. We have to use what we know to change the environment so that the environment nurtures personal strengths, relational supports, spaces and places where children can play and be safe, and institutional opportunities for them to grow and to learn. And that's ultimately why we need to identify and facilitate these combinations of resources that are contextually appropriate, or identify and sustain contextually relevant, multisystemic combinations of resources. When we do that, then we can go a step beyond saying, well, work with a child or work with a young person and teach them to be strong or teach them to be stronger. And we can begin to think about involving things like social prescribing, where we encourage young people to spend time with people who can nurture their well-being, particularly in green spaces. So we've gone beyond social prescribing and multisystemic resilience thinking to talk about green social prescribing and cultural prescribing, the idea that we need to nudge young people to make use of the cultural heritage that can enable their resilience. To do that, we need different types of studies. We literally need to pause, not just on the 24th of September, but we need to pause when we design and think, how can we put together a study that includes people from multiple disciplines, including economists, so that we can better understand which resources at which system level matter for which outcome. Yes, that's expensive. You need big funders. Yes, it's challenging. We very seldom speak the same language when we don't come from the same disciplines. Yes, it's tricky, particularly if you don't involve communities and youth. If you don't involve communities and youth in the design of these studies, you might end up pursuing an outcome that's irrelevant to that community or to those young people. But it's worth doing, because it's only when we do the hard work that we will really be able to discover what that combination is, so that this democracy of ours, which we find so precious, can also result in facilitative environments that mean young people will be well. And now I'll shush.
Thank you so much. The concept of resources is extremely important. And as he suggested, whether they're environmental resources, social resources, personal resources, technological resources, financial resources, all of these matter. And all of these things feed into well-being. And well-being feed into resilience. Now the thing about the connection between well-being and resilience. Resilience is bouncing back from adversity. There are some people, even provided with all these resources, they do not bounce back. So one needs to make a better connection between how do these people bounce back, even provided with all these resources. And I have a psychological, maybe a personality explanation. And the explanation is that for those people who experience high level of well-being, whether it's eudaimonic well-being or hedonic well-being or cognitive well-being, that well-being ultimately becomes a repertoire, a psychological repertoire in their mind. It becomes a bank that they count on. And every time they face adversity, they bounce back because they have quite a bit of savings in that bank. A lot of savings, a lot of goodwill, a lot of good feelings that would allow them to bounce back from adversity. Well-being over time, when they experience, different levels of well-being over time, it becomes dispositional. Dispositional in the sense that it changes their personality. They become more optimistic. They become more open to experience. They become more extroverted. They become, there's a whole bunch of personality traits that ultimately allow them to bounce back. Resources are important, but they do not explain how people bounce back from adversity. Your comment.
Thanks, Joe. That's a very, very valuable comment. And I think personality is included in the personal resources. And just as an aside, in the Welcome study that we're doing, we're measuring those personality, not traits, but we're measuring positive emotion and negative emotion over 24 months to see if it really does play into why they're bouncing back. The idea of bouncing back has been questioned. So in contexts like ours, people often say, so what do I bounce back to? And there's the idea that resilience might be more about bouncing forward. And so as part of that, it's really important that we always understand that, yes, personality could very well be a powerful contributor, but it's part of a combination. So if you are banking on this store or this repertoire, to use your wonderful word, and there's nothing helping you to replenish that from outside you, the chances are it's going to run dry. If I'm wrong, I'll come and report to you in 24 months' time when we've got some of the welcome data. But I just worry that when we emphasize personality, people can say, well, so then you've got to sort it out. We expect young people to literally be solely responsible for their resilience. And yes, they are a contributor, so are we, and so are institutions, and so is the physical environment, or the technological environment, or the financial environment, whichever environment you want to take. We need to better understand. We're not there yet. But we need to better understand what is that network and how does it change over time. Thank you.
I'm just wondering, Joanna refers to personality, but can it be a wider concept that it maybe is more inclusive of certain cultures that's resilient? So what is the causality? Is it because they've got hardship that a culture will be more resilient? Or is it the difficult exogenous situation that builds resilience? Because I always had this imagine that in Africa we experience a resilience that we often don't see in more westernized countries. So is it cultural or is it due to the exogenous factors that we actually see that?
It's a very fascinating question, Talita, and the answer is that we find resilience across the world and across cultures. I think the form that that resilience takes may change according to the culture. So in Africa, we have lots and lots and lots of relationship-enabled resilience, personal-enabled resilience, and then high spiritual-enabled resilience, because that's part of our cultural repertoire. Whereas, for example, in North America, in the context that I've worked in Canada, there is much less of the relational and much more of the self, because it's such a competitive, individualistic community. So what I'm saying is that the combination remains, and you're going to find it across all cultures, I believe, but the form that those resources take is going to be sensitive to the cultural context.
It's really interesting because those are questions I've often thought about, but I don't have your background to be able to answer them.
I think the issue of risk is that if there is no risk, there's no resilience. So when students come late for class and they say, oh, I've had such a bad morning, I'm being resilient, Linda. I go like, no, you're not. That was stressful. That's not resilience, but you're welcome. Come and sit down. So you need that high exposure to high levels of stress to be able to study resilience.
Another question? There are many. Let me see. We go then to Irma, and then there are two questions on that.
Linda, thank you for a fantastic keynote. It's just so inspiring to look into it. My question is, if we could sponsor you to put up a very big billboard by the Schoeman Highway with just one message on it, what would you say on that billboard based on the research that you've done?
It's a fabulous question, Irma. I must remember that. Based on the research that we've done, I would put on that billboard, resilience is not a do-it-yourself job.
This side, there are questions. We go first. Thank you.
Yeah, Linda, I'm very convinced by your explanation of, in your response to Joe, your balance question. It's a cultural issue because we all know the neoliberal order emphasizes personal responsibility. If you're sick, it's your problem. If you have mental health issue, it's your problem. Therefore, it's your problem to also find a solution. You know, relaxation of to staff members. It's all Western universities that do that. So, but it don't change work conditions. So, this balance between personality, individual factors, of course they exist. We are human beings. But this balance between this personal factor and the more cultural, the more societal factors, where you include government influence, etc., social. This is what is specific to a country, to a continent, to a region. And of course the answer, the response, has to, in the policy making, has to be there, finding this balance. I think your work is extremely insightful in this way, because it's a methodology to do policy making.
Yeah. Sorry, were you wanting a response, or was there a question?
No.
So thank you so much. No. What we've experienced in the project is when the young people, you saw a number of photographs of young people's faces with their names. I have their permission to do that. And typically those were young people who are part of our youth advisors. So we set studies up where we have community partners and youth advisors. And what we've experienced is when our youth advisors become the champions of the findings policy changes. So people ignore me quite easily, but they don't ignore that young person who's giving this impassioned account. I'll give you a small example. In the RISE study, we worked in a community where there's a very big industry, and the industry attracts a number of engineers and mathematicians and scientists. And so they provide bursaries in the local schools that support science, maths, and technology. And in the course of the study, young people were saying, but we don't all want to do those science, maths, and technology subjects. Some of us want to do tourism because we think there are beautiful things in Mpumalanga for people to come and see. And so they told this industry that their resilience is a combination of their own agency and these resources, and the resource that they wanted from the industry was, please add a bursary for humanities that allowed tourism studies. And the industry mercifully listened and did it. And I think it's because it was the young people's own voices. We listen too little to young people. We learn too little from them, and we involve them too little in policy making.
Yeah, thank you for the work, not only the presentation, but the work. I think I became familiar with your work a long time ago, and hearing the development of it, I'm very impressed by the development of it and the direction it's taken. So definitely kudos to you for that. I'm following up on an earlier question, which maybe one can understand in terms of, where I heard something in it like, okay, you've been talking about individual resilience and the collective or cultural features that promote it. Can we think about something like a societal resilience or collective resilience? Is there such a thing?
Yeah.
Or are they somehow similar or different? So one can imagine a couple different answers. One is like the societal resilience is the sum of the individual resiliences of the people in society, which probably, I guess, is not a good definition. Another one is kind of what I think you're doing here, which is, okay, a resilient society is one that has the ecological affordances for individual resilience. But I also wonder, like, you take a neoliberal-based society, if that society is more resilient than a society that has more embedded and stronger civic institutions that can withstand, which society is going to be able to withstand some of the pressures that we're facing across the world now. What are your thoughts?
For starters, it's not my field. I have not engaged in any studies of national resilience, but I am aware that they exist. In fact, I think there's a paper towards the end of today's program on national resilience, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in that to go and listen. But the work that is being done does suggest that there are personal systemic drivers that enable national resilience. And certainly we need more of that, because what I suspect is that there is a reciprocity between what's going on at the national level and what's going on at the community level and what's going on at the individual level. And we need to better understand that very complex, it's not even a bidirectionality, it's a multidirectionality, if you like, to be able to better nurture resilience at all levels. So there are studies, there are a number of people who talk about national resilience, the resilience of nation states.
Not only national, but community.
Yeah, there's lots of community resilience, so that would come before nation. But there literally are people who study the resilience of Spain, for example. probably political scientists.